Hello, Jeff Zwarenk, and welcome back to Give and Take, where we explore the latest scientific issues to equip you to share the gospel with those around. Today I'm joined by Ken Samples and Fuzz Rana, and we're going to look at an important question. Does a billions-of-year-old Earth mean that evolution is true? Ken, Fuzz, good to have you back in the studio again.
Hi, Jeff.
So give me a little bit of background here. Why is it that people tend to equate a billions-of-year-old Earth with evolution? What's going on there?
Well, I think a big part of it, Jeff, unfortunately, is that young Earth creationists often obscure the two. You know, they conflate them. And so I had a fellow on my Facebook site. He's a good guy, young Earth creationist. He just, for the life of him, couldn't see the difference between an old Earth view and an evolutionary creation view. He just said, if you believe in an old Earth, you have to believe in evolution.
Yeah, I would agree that young Earth creationists do obscure the two, by equating, again, an Earth that's billions of years old with the evolutionary paradigm. But to be fair to young Earth creationists for just a moment, it is interesting to note that if you pick up a biology textbook, in high school, introductory college textbook in biology, and you go to the section on evolution, one of the pieces of evidence that's marshaled in favor of the idea that life's history is evolutionary is the idea that the Earth has great antiquity, and so therefore there's enough time for evolution to happen.
So there is a little bit of historical perspective in what's going on there. It's not just an automatic association, but in some sense, the scientists themselves have promoted that idea.
That's exactly right. And of course, this goes back to Darwin's day, where Darwin proposes his theory of evolution, which was designed to explain where new species come from, which is, natural selection operating on heritable variation. But then he extends this mechanism over vast periods of time to explain the entirety of biology. But his motivation for doing this was the discovery of people like Lyell and others that the Earth was actually ancient. And so for Darwin, it felt like it gave him enough time that this mechanism could explain all of biology.
So in essence, what you've got there is you've got these kind of, look, we see the variations, things that we can measure, then it's the extrapolation of those through the time. And so in some sense, Christians, if they will, are coming along and saying, well, if there's not enough time, then we can't let evolution happen.
That's exactly right. And so for young Earth creationists, their argument or their approach is to say, but if the Earth is young, then there's no way this mechanism could ever produce all of biology, and that it's only possible if the Earth has vast antiquity.
So are there any other issues in there, or is that that's basically why there's this conflation of the two?
Well, I certainly think kind of picking up Fuzz's point there, a young Earther may say, look, if the Earth is young, then evolution is by default, dropped out of the equation. And so I think that's part of that kind of element. Mm-hmm.
Well, and young Earth creationists too are bothered by the idea that if the Earth has this vast antiquity, that if life has been on Earth for billions of years, then you've got also a vast history of not only life on Earth, but death on Earth. And so they see animal death as being deeply problematic from a Christian perspective.
So in that view, the death would be more comfortable, if you will, in an evolutionary scenario, but in a creationist scenario, now you've got God having this death before any sin or something. That's kind of the idea there, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because there are biblical passages, Psalm 104, Job 38 and 39, that speak about death as being the natural order of things, that this is part of the creation that God instituted. So old Earth creationists would argue, yes, indeed, there was animal death prior to the fall, but human death only occurred at the time of the fall.
So in essence, there's kind of this conflation of death being human death and animal death. So it seems like a lot of things are being conflated there. So let me ask the question, does a billions-of-year-old Earth mean that evolution is true? Is that really the central issue there?
I don't see any reason to think that an ancient universe poses serious challenges to a biblical point of view, or God creating the world, or historic Christian perspective being correct. There are a number of ways that people look at the creation days. Some of them day age, others have more of a literary perspective to them. I don't think the age issue is in and of itself. I don't see it as a challenge.
As an old Earth creationist, I am an anti-evolutionist. I reject significant aspects of the evolutionary paradigm. And what actually motivates me towards that end is the vast history of life on Earth. Because when you look at the history of life on Earth, you see every time there's major innovation, major transitions, they all happen explosively. They happen suddenly in geological instants. The origin of life, the origin of eukaryotic cells, the origin of body plans. Every time you see innovation with mammals, we check that with vertebrates, you see radiation events for fish.
So that's where they happen suddenly and then it kind of spreads out across
explosive
the earth.
Diversification. Yeah, you see it for fish, you see it for amphibians, reptiles, birds 3 times, and mammals. And then when humans come along, there's an explosive appearance of sophisticated behavior. And this is all documented in the fossil record and the archaeological record. So to me, these sudden bursts of creativity point to a creator's handiwork, not an evolutionary framework.
So that's interesting because it seems like, what this idea of billions of years is conflated with the idea that evolution is true, but it really seems like it's a more foundational issue that we're wrestling with is, does the evidence point towards naturalistic random processes or does it point towards a creator? Your answer there says that even in the context of an old Earth, the evidence points towards God's activity in creation as well.
That's exactly right. And we see those fingerprints with these sudden appearances.
So kind of bottom line for what RTB has to say. What does RTB have to say about evolution? I know we believe in an old Earth. Does that mean that we believe in evolution as well?
Well, I think in one sense, we can say that there are natural processes that are part of the created order, and we accept those ideas. But that's very different than saying that we believe in some kind of Darwinian evolution.
So, if you look in the Genesis creation account, is there anything that kind of lends to this idea that God used process, or is it just kind of poof and it's all there?
Well, I think there are times where clearly there is a reference to a created process. On the other hand, when we look at the dust of the ground and the breath of life, there are times where it appears as if it is sudden and immediate. And so I would say both of those, we see examples of sometimes a process, other times a direct intervention that must have been very quick.
So I guess kind of another question I think that I've wrestled with, and I imagine people do, if there's a process involved, doesn't that remove God's input into it?
I don't think so. If you just think of creation ex nihilo, God calls all things into existence from nothing. There's also God holding that universe in place, directing that universe. And so even though you have these quote-unquote natural processes, God's providential hand is still directly involved.
So what would you say, Fuzz? I know you've kind of highlighted a little bit, but where are some of the places that even though the Earth is very old, you think there's the most potent evidence that God's activity is involved, or God is involved in the activity?
Well, to me, I always like to go to an event called the Cambrian Explosion. This is an event in life's history that happened, 520 million years ago, where virtually out of nowhere in a geological instant, every animal phyla that we've ever known of shows up.
So phyla,
suddenly.
That's the basic body plans of things. So this is a pretty broad class. This is not just birds becoming birds with longer beaks. This is very different.
Yeah, fundamentally different designs for these organisms are represented by body plans or phyla. And they just show up virtually out of nowhere without any kind of history preceding them. It looks like a creation event. It defies an evolutionary explanation. It's one of the major problems in evolutionary biology. And I'm immediately drawn to the 5th day of creation where God says, let the waters teem with life. Because the Cambrian explosion involved animals that would have lived in the Earth's oceans. And so the descriptor that you see in Genesis 1 on the 5th day of creation is a remarkable description in light of the scientific evidence that we see for the origin of animals.
And that's very consistent with what RTB has said all along. We obviously believe that the Earth is really much older than a few thousand years, that it really is billions of years old. But by no means do we see that as a sign that natural processes account for everything or that God's not involved. In fact, in the way the fossil record and the history of life on Earth looks, we see evidence for God's fingerprints and handiwork. And in fact, if you want to explore that deeper, we've actually developed a video called Creation, Evolution, and Biblical Inerrancy that gives you a chance to dig deep and see how God's activity plays out in an old earth perspective in a way that equips you to go share the gospel. So I'd encourage you to go explore that and be confident going out and sharing the gospel, knowing that God's word and his revelation will always be found trustworthy.